In the last case, we covered one in Canada up in Toronto of Kenneth Parks murdering his mother-in-law. Now we're coming back to the States. Let's not waste any time. This story is from a murder that happened in Phoenix on January 16, 1997. Tony Braxton's Unbreak My Heart was #1 song in the country. Michael was #1 movie in the country. And 10 days later, the Green Bay Packers would go on to win Super Bowl 31 against the New England Patriots. It was sometime around 10 p.m. when neighbor Greg Coons went outside to investigate screaming coming from next door. Greg's wife had heard moaning, and being the protector he was, he went outside to check it out, to kind of secure the perimeter. He walks outside looking over his fence to see his next door neighbor Scott Falater brutally stabbing his wife. Scott wouldn't let up. Greg couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Scott and Yarmila were his neighbors for years. He had never even heard them argue, never even heard Scott raise his voice. They even went to the same church. Now he was witnessing Scott murder his beloved wife right before his very eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, Scott stopped thrusting a large hunting knife. The next thing he did was very odd. Scott disappeared into the house, turning the lights on and off. Scott reappeared wearing different clothes, and now he had gloves on. The family's golden retriever was outside whimpering, probably at the sight of his master. Scott would try to get the dog to hush. Then he would go over to Yarmila's seemingly lifeless body. She may have been dead at this point. She had suffered 44 stab wounds. Scott would roll her body over to their pool, where he would hold her under the water. Coons would call 911 and explain to them what was happening. When Scott felt he had done enough, he left his wife's lifeless body floating at the surface of the pool. He then took his clothes that were saturated with blood, wrapped them around the hunting knife, put them in a piece of Tupperware, and stashed it in the wheel well of his Volvo. This would later be a key piece of evidence to the prosecution's case against Scott, because they would claim he was trying to get rid of evidence. Therefore, he wasn't sleepwalking because he knew exactly what he had done, and he knew that what he had done was wrong. But before we go any further, I want to give a little background. Scott Falater and Yarmila Kleskin originally met decades earlier in high school, where they started dating, and later married in 1976 when they were only 20 years old. They were both raised Catholic but would convert to Mormonism. Scott would become an electrical engineer for Motorola, and Yarmila a preschool teaching aide. They would have 2 children, a son and a daughter. Son Michael would say he had a great childhood. It was so laid back at his house. Like others that knew his parents, he would say he never saw any problems in the marriage. There was no fights or arguments that he could recall. In most cases like these, there will be a secret that is uncovered. It's usually one of 2 things. The first thing is that one spouse kills the other to collect on a large insurance policy because their love for money is way stronger than the love toward their spouse. Or to put it simply, they have no love for their spouse and probably never did. The other motive is that there was a scandalous affair going on, and the spouse is now in the way. Or the spouse has to be killed because they can't get a divorce because divorce is a sin. So it is now over 26 years later, and there is no scandal that was ever surfaced in this case. We still only know that Scott was a mild-mannered, loving husband and father, and had absolutely no reason to do what he did. So let's get back to that night. This is what Scott says he remembers from that night. On January 16th, he had worked a full day. He came home to have dinner with the family. Before work the next morning, he was to give a lesson for a religious class he taught regularly. And so that night, he would prepare the lesson. Scott claimed that night his wife asked him to fix the pool filter. He went out to take a look at it around 9 p.m., but realized it was too difficult to do in the dark. He went inside and kissed his wife goodnight, who was already asleep on the couch. Scott would retire to the bedroom. Scott estimates he went to bed sometime between 9:30 and 10 p.m. The next thing that Scott remembers would be described as waking up from a dream and into a nightmare. Scott would feel sensory overload as his vision came into focus. An officer was screaming for him to get on the ground and pointing a gun at him as he stood at the top of his stairs, totally confused. Scott was wondering what was going on. Why are the police at my house? Scott says he remembers absolutely nothing. When the police got the full story from the next door neighbor, they did not believe Scott's sleepwalking defense for a second. Scott would enter a plea of not guilty. He has maintained to this day that him and his wife had a good marriage. He would gain nothing from murdering her, and even though he accepted responsibility right away that he committed the act, he has no recollection of doing it, and he never had planned it out. It is also worth noting that Scott did have a history of sleepwalking. Some members of his family would be open to giving interviews of Scott's history with sleepwalking. When he was 20, his sister Laura tried to wake him up while he was sleepwalking and trying to walk outside. He violently threw her to the other side of the room. She said the look on his face was animalistic, and she had never saw him like that before. Scott's mother, Lois Wilczek, would say that Scott would sometimes sleepwalk downstairs late at night, prepared to go to school. Other times he would sleepwalk naked, and he would have no recollection of these events. These events would typically occur when Scott was feeling a lot of stress in his life. Falater had hired Michael Kimmerer and Lori Vopel as his attorneys. The defense, of course, said that Scott did the act unconsciously. There was no malice or intent, and therefore he was not criminally responsible in the eyes of the law. Daughter Megan, 17 at the time, would testify for the defense. She would admit to seeing her father angry before, but never in a rage. She would say that her mother was her best friend. When asked what would happen with her brother when she goes off to college next year, she said she hopes her dad will be able to take care of him. She was clearly on her dad's side and didn't believe he had intended to kill her mom. Liz Biggs, who was best friends with Yarmila, testified that Scott and Yarmila seemed like the all-American couple. She also testified that Yarmila had told her about sleepwalking episodes that Scott had during the marriage, that Scott would rummage through closets and clothing in the middle of the night and clearly be unaware of what he was doing. Scott would take the stand in his own defense. Prosecutor Juan Martinez would go after Falater hard, accusing Scott of calling his own wife dumpy. Scott would protest and say he loved his wife. He never said she was dumpy, that his wife was large, that he liked large women, and had always thought his wife was beautiful. Prosecutor wanted to ask Falater about a statement he made to a shrink in prison that tried to show motive of Scott killing Yarmila because she had committed an quote-unquote unforgivable sin. Scott said the prosecutor misunderstood from the report and that Scott himself had committed the unforgivable sin when he took Yarmila's life, and now he has no salvation and didn't believe he would be reunited with her in the afterlife. The prosecution would try to say motive was that Yarmila didn't want to have any kids, and Scott thought this was an unforgivable sin on her part. Scott outright denied these claims. Prosecution admitted an athletic mouthpiece into evidence that was found in the Tupperware with the knife and the bloody clothing. Prosecution would insinuate that Falater put the mouthpiece in before the attack to protect himself. Scott couldn't explain it. He said if he had seen it in the garage, he may have picked it up and put it in his mouth without thinking about it. There were two renowned sleep analyst experts brought in to testify, Dr. Roger Broughton and Dr. Rosalind Cartwright. Cartwright would say this was the purest form of sleepwalking she had seen in 30 years. They testified that they believed Scott was sleepwalking and Yarmila got in his way somehow or obstructed what he was doing. In Scott's state of mind, perceived her to be a threat and attacked her. It was hard for the defense to explain why Scott was appearing to hide the murder weapon and bloody clothing, and Scott's two attorneys gave conflicting reasons for this, which did not look good. Scott ended up being found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. The jurors had made up their minds. It was hard for some of the jurors to look past the brutality of the killing and thought if he was indeed sleepwalking, he wouldn't be able to carry out so many different tasks. The sleepwalking defense wasn't holding water. It didn't make sense to them. There were others that thought the sleepwalking defense was plausible, but a mother of two had just lost her life. He can't just get a pass. Not only that, but if he is back on the streets, who's to say it wouldn't happen again, especially if he experiences stress? Some jurors have said that they would buy the sleepwalking story if he had only just stabbed her the 44 times, but drowning her afterward discredited the defense. Nowadays, 26 years later, Scott will serve out the rest of his days at the Yuma Prison Complex Cibola Unit in San Luis, Arizona. He is a model prisoner. He has worked as a tutor and also as a porter. He is not working at the moment. He might be retired if they allow retirement in prison. Scott thinks about that terrible night. He says that it tears him apart knowing how his wife must have suffered, but he is confident they will be reunited one day in heaven. His faith has been restored. If you had heard my last story about the Kenneth Parks case, I'd like to compare the two. These are two similar but yet very different stories. Did the jury get it wrong in either case? I think it could be possible the jury got it wrong in both cases. In the first one, it is hard for me to shake off the fact the perpetrator drove, and for such a long distance, in his sleep. I feel like he would have to be conscious in order to do that. Was he able to understand what he was doing but powerless to stop himself? And why did his unconscious self choose his in-laws as his victims, who had always been so good to him? This is pretty confusing. If this happened in the US, would a jury have found him not guilty? I think Americans may be more skeptical, and the case may have had a different outcome. In this case of Scott Falater, I feel like this guy may be serving out a life sentence when he in fact never committed a crime. His whole demeanor and what others have said about him leads me to believe he couldn't hurt a fly. But there is an unconscious dark passenger, if you will, that comes out when he is stressed and goes for a sleep stroll. He claims that he couldn't remember anything during the attack, and that story has never changed. If a guy can sleep drive 15 miles, why is it so implausible for this guy to be asleep when he carried out these acts? At this point, he does not try to appeal the court's decision. He accepted a long time ago that he will die in prison, and he seems like he is at peace with that. What are your thoughts?
Ah!